This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, across Bloomberg platforms. Carol Massar, Tim Stenovec, live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Let's get to the setup on this Thursday, March 5th, 2026. We've got a renewed spike in oil prices. We saw WTI actually hitting $80 a barrel. That, combined with some data, economic data here in the U.S. showing labor market resilience, lifted Treasury yields, and we have seen U.S. stocks under pressure amid reduced odds of Fed interest rate cuts. That 10-year back above 4.1%. More on that to come, and that ain't the only thing we're following.
No, President Trump removed Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary. This after months of controversy. Also announced that he would replace her with Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin. We're going to have much more on this and all the breaking news that just continues to unfold in just a few minutes.
A lot coming at all of us and at the investment environment. And so ahead this hour, first of all, we're going to get into how the Iran war shock threatens to unleash a wave of global inflation. We continue to talk about inflation worries here in the U.S., but perhaps that could be true around the world.
Well, look no further than oil prices. You mentioned WTI, the U.S. benchmark hitting $80 for the first time since January of 2025. Carol, it's up 40.8% year to date. Same with Brent.
Yeah, quite a big move to the upside. All right, so we're going to get into that. Plus, another cockroach in the private credit world drops. We'll get to that. That is among our most read stories on this Thursday.
And on the macro, Aaron Kennon is stopping by, CEO of Clear Harbor Asset Management. He's going to tie it all together for investors.
Yeah, so easy for anybody managing money right now. All right, let's get to it, folks. Let's get a check on that trading session. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. Lots of breaking stories. Let's recap and reset. President Trump has removed Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary after months of controversy. Also announced he will be replacing her with Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin. Trump posted on social media that Noem will take a role as special envoy for the Western Hemisphere. The change marks the first time that Trump has replaced a cabinet member during his second term. Crude topping $80 a barrel for the first time since January of 2025. West Texas Intermediate crude now at $80.93, up now by 8.4%. Brent crude surging 4.7%, $85.26 a barrel. And U.S. officials have written draft regulations to restrict AI chip shipments to anywhere in the world without American approval. Shares of Advanced Micro Devices down 2.5%. NVIDIA down now by 1.5%. And the SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, it is down by 2.6%. All of this against the backdrop of a move lower for the U.S. stock market, a move higher for oil. S&P down 86, drop right now of 1.3%. The Dow is down 2.1%, down 1,039 points. NASDAQ is down 253 for NASDAQ, a drop now of 1.1%. The 10-year 4.13% with the 2-year 3.59%. Gold is down $63 the ounce to $5,076, a drop there of 1.2%. Crude $80.97 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate crude up 8.5%. Again, Brent crude up by 4.8%. And a sell-off for Bitcoin down 2.9%. Bitcoin 71,183. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. We did mention the breaking news. Kristi Noem is actually speaking right now at the Sergeant Benevolent Association Major Cities Conference in Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to monitor that, and we'll bring you any headlines if we do hear them.
And it's safe to say the headline is that the president has removed her as Homeland Security Secretary after months of controversy. We know she was up before members of Congress just this week, just yesterday. He did announce he would replace her with Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin. So again, as Tim mentioned, we'll monitor her comments and bring you any headlines as they are known. Meantime, we got to talk about what's going on in the energy market, because that has really been a large reason for what we are seeing in the trade today.
Okay, so I'm just going to GLCO on the Bloomberg terminal, global commodities. WTI crude, $80.90 a barrel, Carol. Trading is higher than average significantly by about more than 25%. Year to date, it's up 41%. Brent, $85.15 a barrel, up 40%. so far this year.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say both WTI and Brent up around 20% in just the last 5 to 7 days. So essentially in the last week. So we've seen incredible upward momentum, understandably so, about concerns about Iran and then ultimately the U.S. war in Iran. Markets have been rocked by the war, which entered its 6th day. No immediate prospect of a resolution in sight. As Tim mentioned, really boosting a lot of prices in the energy sector, product prices, lifting freight rates, and spawning a wave of disruption for producers and importers. So as inflation expectations have built, we've seen this play out certainly in the Treasury market. We've seen U.S. yields move up. Traders have also paired bets on Fed easing. Swaps are pricing in less than 40 basis points of cuts in 2026. Tim, that compares with about 60 basis points at the end of last week.
Well, addressing the spike in energy, Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond President Tom Barkin spoke exclusively earlier today to Bloomberg News' Mike McKee.
Gas prices, obviously, if they're up, that is inflationary. Textbook monetary policy would be you look through a short-term shock, but you don't look through a long-term shock. And I think that's a lot of the assessment people are going to have to make.
Well, there you have it. That was Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond President Tom Barkin. For more on the conversation, you can check it out on the Bloomberg terminal and at Bloomberg.com. So, Carol, let's get to the heart of the trade, energy prices, and how the president's war with Iran threatens to deal that severe blow to a global economy that's still grappling with the impact of that tariff hike.
So much to kind of take into account. That is our world, everybody, as you well know. Jenny Welch is with us. She's Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst. She joins us from the Bloomberg News DC Bureau. Jenny, so good to be back with you. A lot to take into account in today's environment. Tim and I were kind of musing in a stressful way, just coming into our show, like, wait, it's all just continuing to come at us. It feels like many continue to kind of somewhat brush off higher energy prices. Markets not necessarily, though, today, thinking this war may be a short thing. How are you and the Bloomberg Economics team kind of thinking about the impact, and what is the impact already?
Yeah, exactly on that point. We did a scenario exercise actually months ago, well before this conflict, looking at what could happen in the Middle East and gaming out worst case scenarios, which are what's playing out right now in terms of a direct U.S., Israel, Iran conflict. And in our estimation, if there are going to be sustained, persistent disruptions to energy facilities in the region, the Strait of Hormuz, that could actually lead oil prices to top $100. We estimate reaching up to $108 a barrel. That's not where markets are today, and we think that's probably because they think that these will be short-term disruptions. But as you mentioned, the conflict doesn't look like it's anywhere close to ending. And in fact, Iran is promising a new wave of retaliation, just as President Trump is promising a new big wave of attacks. So I think we're likely to see fighting continue for at least the next few days. The question is, how long can Iran in particular sustain its attacks while its leadership is also under siege?
Jennifer, while you're doing that scenario analysis, how are you defining short-term versus long-term, and what would it take in terms of a conflict such as this to get oil prices up to that $112 a barrel?
I think it will be key to figure out for oil markets how long they think these disruptions are going to last. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively paralyzed right now. We don't see traffic really moving through it. The United States is trying to reopen it by promising naval escorts, insurance for ships. We haven't yet seen if there's going to be much uptake on it or how the U.S. is actually going to follow through on those policies. And the risk is that even if you take out a lot of Iran's missile launchers, as the United States and Israel have to date, they still have a lot of other weapons that they can use to disrupt traffic. All it takes is the odd drone attack to make tankers question the risk assessment of whether or not it's worth trying to travel through the strait. I think what we're watching to see is, when do oil markets start to grapple with that reality, and do we start to see them price it in more? At the moment, they seem to be betting that all of this is just going to be a few more days of disruption and we're going to be back to normal very soon.
Hey, there are sometimes reports about off-ramps, and there was something this morning. This is from CNYR. Iran's deputy foreign minister, Iran, ready to abandon nuclear program if the U.S. offers a satisfactory alternative. What are you guys hearing at all? Because this is what helps you figure out what the U.S. or global economic impact is. What are you hearing at all about the possibility for some kind of conclusion or off-ramp that Iran might be actually offering up to the United States?
I think an important point of context is that there are multiple actors within Iran. Not all of them speak with the same voice, right? We heard similarly de-escalatory remarks from the foreign ministry earlier this week where they said, we're not going to close the Strait of Hormuz at the same time that the IRGC was telling tankers to stay away. So I think it's important to pay attention to who are going to be the more authoritative voices in the system. Those are probably the ones that, for example, are more hardline, are more conservative, are less willing to work with the U.S. and are thinking, we are suffering pain, but we're going to make U.S. partners in the region and the global economy suffer more, and that's going to lead them to fold first. So at the moment, we see the more authoritative actors in Tehran just kind of digging in their heels and preparing to fight for a longer period of time.
Yeah, let's go to some of these headlines now. Iran hasn't asked for a ceasefire, the minister tells NBC. Iran edges toward choosing a new leader. The president, though, President Trump says he should be involved. We mentioned the rise in oil prices, the stocks that are weighed down by the ramifications of that war, and Israel continues to target Iran's IRGC sites. So Jenny, on Carol's question about a potential off-ramp, we also consider the power vacuum in the country. And curious about your view on this, because the president seems to go back to what happened in Venezuela just a little over a month ago and talk about the success there, and Delcy Rodriguez is acting as president there right now. There is no Delcy Rodriguez of Iran. There is no person that the U.S. had lined up to take the role of the Ayatollah, or at least rule the country. What's a plausible scenario for what that looks like?
Yes, the contrast between Venezuela and Iran are limitless. And I think what's important to point out is, first, yes, the Islamic Republic has suffered some major losses of leaders and senior officials, but the system remains in place, and it's widespread and it is entrenched. There are people who are in the process of choosing a new supreme leader, and if for whatever reason that gets disrupted, there will be other candidates that they will choose from. The IRGC itself is 200,000 people spread across the country. So yes, Israel and U.S. strikes have taken out quite a few of the senior leaders, but there are still many of them remaining. So I think what all of that suggests is we're not likely to see what President Trump hoped for on Saturday morning when he announced these strikes of the Iranian people rising up and taking, I think as he referred to it, their future into their own hands. What we're likely to see is either a persistence of this system or a new, but probably still authoritarian system take its place. And so I don't think we're likely to see a Venezuela model where you have a government that maybe could move towards democracy on a somewhat orderly timeline. I think the best case is we either get a ceasefire with the current system, or we see a very chaotic and a very unpredictable world emerge where there is some sort of internal fighting or a complete collapse of the system and power vacuum.
And safe to say, Jenny, you need boots on the ground in order for actually even to push for more change. I mean, you guys in this story say authorities are tightening control of the streets. No organized opposition operates inside the country. So kind of business as usual to some extent.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of the United States, President Trump has been really clear to not put constraints on whether he would put boots on the ground, but that would be a really risky endeavor, put a lot of U.S. lives at risk and be very costly. So I think it's probably something he doesn't want to do. Now, there are other options. The U.S. has used proxies in the past, and that might be something that's under consideration. But the history of regime change efforts has shown you can't really change a regime just through air power alone. You have to have boots on the ground.
Yeah, and all of this, of course, as central banks around the globe are trying to figure out the inflationary pressures as a result of higher energy prices. Do they persist short-term, long-term? They're going to have to figure out policy against all of this. Jenny, thank you, as always. Jenny Welch, she's Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst. Just a programming note, we're going to get an update on the war, the U.S. war with Iran. That's later today when U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is expected to give an update, so we will take you there live. That's around 4:30 p.m. Wall Street time.
Well, the other big note is what's happening with investors and for investors right now, along with questions about the spend on AI and the continued concerns about private credit, trying to assess all the risks out there. With more on the trade, let's bring in Aaron Kennon. He's co-founder and CEO of Clear Harbor Asset Management, just under $2 billion in assets under management. He joins us from Stanford. Aaron, the message earlier this week when it came to the effect of this war on markets was sit on your hands, don't do anything. Is that still the message right now?
Well, I think it's difficult to take new cash and to allocate it for the first time in this market, but certainly there's been a significant amount of churning within a market in the United States that doesn't appear to have done much since missiles started landing in Tehran. I mean, the S&P is only down about 1% since last Friday. But if you take a look at sort of like the average S&P stock, Tim, year to date, the peak to trough has been closer to 13, 14%. So there's been a lot of movement. Even technology, we've seen this huge software correction over the last year, and the fear is AI disintermediation. But if you look at, again, since Friday, which segment of the market has actually performed extraordinarily well? The software segment within technology. So even though software is down 19%, that segment's up 6%. So there's still lots of opportunities here. And ultimately, it comes back to, widening the aperture as an investor. How much time do you have in the market? What are your objectives? And where are there opportunities?
Hey, Aaron, is it kind of hard, though, right now to figure out what the floor is that's fundamentally based for the investment environment as we try to wait and see how long this war goes on, as we just kind of wait for other policies from the administration, tariff or otherwise, and then you've got the policies that are stimulative as a result of President's big, beautiful bill. So do we really kind of know what the investment or investing floor is at this point, or not yet?
Yeah, I think, Carol, geopolitical events, and I don't want to, take this particular war lightly. I think it could be more prolonged than not. And I think there could be some negative risks to it. And certainly there are actually some significant positive outcomes that I'm hopeful of here. But if you look at the end of the day, valuation, and you think about the long term or even medium term, like 3-4 years, we think that there are plenty of opportunities here. I mean, there was just a huge technology conference this week, and it was essentially open to the public by one of the large banks, and CEOs of major technology firms were talking about their business models. And it didn't have to do with defense spending. It didn't have to do with deficit spending. It had to do with consumer consumption and sort of the evolving patterns of artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And that wheel continues to roll despite this very unfortunate occurrence in the Middle East.
It does, but I mean, I go back to oil prices and the inflationary effect of that. I mean, with Brent up 40%, WTI up 41% just this year, barely into the third month, gas prices up more than 20% on average across the country. That eats into the way consumers spend and think about their own savings.
Absolutely, Tim. And that's something we have a keen eye on for sure. To what extent will this 20-30 cent move in gasoline prices just this week potentially move higher? And to what extent will that weigh on consumer spending, consumer confidence, overall inflationary patterns? To what extent could that weigh on the cost of key economies like in Europe, particularly Germany, where they're focused very much on industrial and manufacturing? When you have an 80% rise year to date, not just over the last couple of years in natural gas prices, and I know that's spot price, not contracted price, but eventually it does sort of weigh into the sort of cost of manufacturing. But if we widen the aperture, we think there's still a pro-cyclical trade that is going on both home and abroad across materials, energy, which has received unfortunately, the tailwind's been war, but received a little bit of a tailwind since Friday. But frankly, the vast majority of the rally in energy that we've seen, meaning energy stocks, that is, came well before any missiles started flying in Iran. And that was probably due to price, valuation, and the expectation that we're going to continue to have energy demand and different opportunities, not just in oil and natural gas, but across LNG, exports. Yep.
All right. We got to run, unfortunately. Aaron, thank you so much. Glad you could check in with us. Aaron Kennon, co-founder, CEO of Clear Harbor Asset Management. Coming up next, we've got the most read story on the Bloomberg about another private credit markdown, this one to zero, and this involving the world's largest asset manager. Also coming up later, Pete Hegseth. We'll hear from him at 4:30 Wall Street time. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. Stocks are being hit by a rout in chip makers as oil tops $81 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate crude right now trading at 80.91. That is a gain of 8.4%. S&P down 83, down 1.2%. The Dow is down 2.1% now, down more than 1,000 points. Nasdaq down by 1%. The SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, down now by 2.5%, with a 10-year 4.12%. Gold down 1.5%, 5,064 the ounce. And again, West Texas Intermediate crude up 8.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, as you know, President Trump removing Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary after months of controversy. A lot been going on, even just this week as she was answering questions before a congressional committee. He did announce he would replace her with Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullins. So joining us now with more, watching this unfold, as well as our own Jeff Mason, Bloomberg News Washington and White House correspondent. He is on the North Lawn of the White House. Jeff, maybe not a total surprise, but is she, by being named to do something else, is she being removed, or is this a better thing for her?
Oh, no. She's been fired. I mean, that's what this means. She's being replaced. She's being taken out of the cabinet. Have you guys heard of this other thing?
No.
I haven't heard of it.
The special envoy for the Shield of Americas, is that what it is?
Yeah. So I think it's fair to conclude that she has been toppled. And that the president was very upset with her. And in fact, I have a source who said just that he was really mad that she said in her congressional hearings this week that he had, that he had approved this roughly $200 million ad spend, which was so controversial at that hearing. He hadn't, according to my source, and he has also said publicly now that he hasn't, or that he hadn't. And of the multiple mistakes, I think it's fair to say that Secretary Noem has made over the last year, it was this that really got her, because she said something about the president that wasn't true.
That's really, that kind of goes to my next question, Jeff, and it's this idea that, you know, if we were to be talking about this 4 or 5 weeks ago, we'd be talking about what happened in Minneapolis, and there were a lot of people around that time who thought that maybe it was the ISIS killing of 2 Americans in Minneapolis that would lead to the loss of her job. But you're saying no, it's one thing that she said in congressional testimony earlier this week.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and you're absolutely right to have mentioned what happened in Minneapolis. Certainly, in a more traditional administration, which this is not, a Secretary of Homeland Security presiding over the deaths of 2 civilians by ICE agents, who, when she was referring to those civilians, her initial instinct was to call them domestic terrorists. That probably would have gotten you fired in another administration. It didn't here. It did create some bad press, obviously, and the president generally doesn't like bad press, although I think his attitude about press generally stems from his time in New York, where no press is bad press. But in this case, that wasn't the thing that brought her down. It was the congressional testimony this week, which was quite dramatic, and I think you showed a little clip of that, or at least we did earlier on BTV. And that's just, if you go and you say something about the president that isn't true, that's going to get under his skin, and it did.
Yep, even for someone who was certainly very loyal, a loyal lieutenant to the to the Trump administration. Jeff, we're going to come back to you in just a moment. Right now, though, Kristi Noem continuing to speak at the Sergeant Benevolent Association Major Cities Conference. It's underway in Nashville, Tennessee. We are monitoring headlines, and we'll certainly bring you any as she continues speaking there. But Jeff, having said that, it does remind us all that you do have these loyal lieutenants that, you know, she took a very hardline approach. She helped, in this sharp drop in illegal crossings at the U.S. southern border. But it is a reminder that there is even a line for the president when it comes to even those who are so loyal to him.
That's the line. I think that's exactly right. But I also think you're right to note that she has been a loyal lieutenant, and she hasn't been freelancing in that sense. I mean, she was absolutely representing the policies that President Trump espouses, and her hardline views about immigrants, her hardline views on the border, echoed the message from the top, and that was the message from her boss, President Trump. I also think it's pretty important to note that this is the first major cabinet firing of President Trump's presidency, right?
Yes.
And that's a big deal, number one, because it's a cabinet firing, but number two, because that hasn't been his MO in term 2.0.
What does it, Jeff, what does that say about, that's I think a really important point, because we were talking about that in the newsroom, for him to do this. What does that kind of say about?
There was a reassignment for Michael Waltz from National Security.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But this is...
And you're right to mention that one.
Yeah.
And technically, was he in the cabinet? I'm not sure if that counts as being in the cabinet when you're the National Security Advisor, but certainly that was a big move as well. But he landed in a much more high-profile position at the UN, and Secretary Noem, it does not seem like that's the landing for her is going to be as soft. Either way, it's the first cabinet secretary who's been fired, and that was a more frequent occurrence during his first term, which I covered as well. Yeah. It has not been a hallmark of his second term, and that is largely, I would say, because he has surrounded himself with loyalists. He has surrounded himself with people who don't challenge him, who represent exactly what his inner desires are, whether it's with regard to domestic policy or foreign policy. And Secretary Noem fits that mold. She really was a lieutenant, as you said, and a spokesperson for him and for them being the rest of the administration on immigration until now.
All right. Well, another busy day, certainly in the nation's capital. Jeff Mason, thank you so much. Jeff, of course, is Bloomberg News, Washington, and White House correspondent. Well, the story on Kristi Noem is the most read on the Bloomberg in the past 60 minutes. Now let's get, Tim, to the story that is the most read in the past 8 hours.
And that's about another cockroach, perhaps. Private credit concerns continue to mount, so it seems. This time, BlackRock slashed the value of a private loan to zero just 3 months after assessing it at 100 cents on the dollar, marking the second sudden wipeout to recently hit its private credit division. Private credit, it's something that recently at Bloomberg Invest, our annual gathering of the top names in the investing and deal-making worlds, talked a lot about. It's also top of mind for many of the voices on Bloomberg overall this past week.
I've been surprised by the isolation of just private credit. I think there's still a complete misunderstanding of what that represents in the economy.
We're watching very closely to see if there's been a little bit too much aggression, frothiness in those markets. But fundamentally, when you look at the underlying credit portfolios, particularly below investment grade credit, while there have been a bunch of idiosyncratic events where there have been problems, the broad portfolios are performing reasonably well.
As soon as Wall Street sees credit turn a little bit, what they'll do is the credit lines that they're now providing into that sector, they'll tweak it a little bit. They'll pull some back.
I think this will be a shakeout. I don't think it is going to be short term.
And I believe it's in the back of people's minds that actually believe, you know what, if private credit goes, the Fed's going to have no choice but to bail it out. And they're probably right.
All right. For those of you, though, listening on radio, Danny Moses of Moses Ventures founder, that was the last voice. Then you heard Mark Rowan of Apollo Global Management before him. David Solomon, of course, the CEO of Goldman Sachs. That was earlier today on Bloomberg television. And also John Zito over at Apollo Asset Management, co-president there. So all of these big thinkers when it comes to private credit.
Well, with more on where we are when it comes to private credit, and someone who was at Bloomberg Invest this past week, Davide Scigliuzzo joins us. He's Bloomberg News Chief Correspondent for Private Capital. He joins us here in the studio. I want to start with BlackRock slashing the value of the private loan to zero just 3 months after assessing it at 100 cents on the dollar. It's not a big loan.
Absolutely, yeah.
But $25 million is a lot of money for a lot of people.
In the scope of the money that BlackRock manages, it's not a big deal.
But what does it signal to you and to us?
It's BlackRock.
Look, it's BlackRock. It's one of the most sophisticated professional managers out there. You know, when I was a cub reporter covering credit, I learned one thing. Like, in credit, you have a good day if you're making your coupon and you're not losing any money. So for a loan to go from 100 to zero, something really dramatic has had to happen to the company, or something really wrong was with the original underwriting. So that's why those situations, it's the second one that BlackRock has had in this private credit fund, kind of matter, even though they're small.
How do you kind of cross? Because things that we heard at Invest, things that we are hearing in general when it comes to private credit, and I'm always a little skeptical for people who are, maybe talking their book, that they're going to be careful.
Everything's fine.
But I also know they also have fiduciary responsibilities too, right? To their investors too. But I don't know, what was your takeaway, especially after Bloomberg Invest? You talked several panels and talking to people in the midst of this.
I think the message is pretty consistent. You just had David Solomon. He summed it up pretty well. Like, the portfolios overall and the returns of the funds are actually performing well. There have been situations, idiosyncratic, where we've seen losses, and those matter, and we should pay attention to them. I think what they bring to the fore, though, is a broader kind of underlying concern about the quality of the valuations and the marks, particularly in private credit. That's a concern that people have had for a very long time.
Right.
And now they're getting spooked when they see loans drop so fast and so dramatically. They kind of worry about what else is out there that we're not seeing yet.
Well, why are the loans dropping in value so quickly? Is it because people are having trouble paying them back?
It's a combination of issue. I would say that this one we wrote about recently was in a space, Amazon aggregators, that had a tremendous amount of disruption. So this is not something that's happened yesterday. It's a sector that's received a lot of capital back in 21, 22, and since then has performed really poorly across the board. And BlackRock had flagged this in their filings that there was going to be a big write-down. They wrote down the value of the entire fund by 19%. So when you look at the individual loans, that's not a big deal, but 19% of the entire fund starts becoming like a bigger issue. So it's a combination of like companies that weren't performing well and maybe managers were slow to recognize problems. And just the reflection of the underwriting environment that we were in back in 2021.
Well, that's what I want to go. How much of is that? How much of this was the underwriting happened when money costs nothing? And so a deal that looks good when rates are at nothing look great, but not where they are today. How much of it is that? How much of the loans were written back then, and that's what we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard Lloyd Blankfein talk about that point too, like the kind of behavior that sets in towards the end of a credit cycle when money is easy and you're kind of under pressure to make more loans because you have capital to deploy. And so we have seen a lot of situations in 21, 22 that turned out to be very bad deals. And that cuts both ways. It's not just the private markets, it's also the public markets. And you've seen banks suffer from that as well.
So Davide, at what point are you going to be there sitting here writing that the contagion has spread?
Into the wee hours over the weekend.
And not a prediction for when that happens, but the signal that will tell you that, okay, this is something bigger.
I think what everyone is focused on right now is liquidity, especially in the private credit portfolios, where you've seen investors try to redeem their shares. The other piece of it is all of these funds have leverage. So there are bank lines.
Right.
At some point, if a lot of the money from the retail investors, that's the equity, comes out, you need to see a readjustment in the amount of leverage and borrowing that those funds can support. I think we're far from that.
But bank earnings are always opportunities to see, right? Because of their exposure.
I think it'll be interesting to watch the language from bank executives around that space for sure.
Davide, thank you so much. Really appreciate
Always
it. I know you've
pleasure.
had a busy week. Pleasure's ours too. Davide Scigliuzzo, he is Bloomberg News Chief Correspondent for Private Capital. Keep in mind, looking ahead to the weekend, things when it's private credit, everything in the investment world. In-depth conversations on Bloomberg this weekend with David Gora, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Matteo. Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV, 7 a.m. Eastern, Saturdays and Sundays. We're coming back on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red right now. S&P down 1.3%. Stocks are falling on news that the U.S. is requiring permits for AI semiconductor sales. The S&P again down 1.3% right now. NVIDIA shares, they are sinking by 1.6%. Also, the war on Iran boosting oil and gas prices. West Texas Intermediate crude currently trading at $80.94 a barrel, did top 81. Today, we're looking at WTI up by 8.4%. S&P down 90, decline there of 1.3%. The Dow down 1,110 points, down 2.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 262 for NASDAQ, a drop today of 1.2%. The SOX, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Stock Exchange Index, down now by 2.8%, even as Broadcom shares advance 2%. 2.7%. The 10-year, 4.14%, but the 2-year, 3.59%. Spot gold is down 1.5%, 5,062 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude, 81 even right now, up 8.5%. Bitcoin down 3.1%, 71,095. Berkshire Hathaway CEO Greg Abel says he'll be using all of his take-home pay to acquire the conglomerate stock for as long as he is in that role. Berkshire shares, the Class A shares, right now they are up by 2.1%. Again, recapping, S&P down 1.3%, West Texas Intermediate crude 81.04 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Well, global birth rates are in a significant long-term decline, with the total fertility rate falling from approximately 5 in 1960 to around 2.2 to 2.4 in the 2020s, nearing, Tim, the replacement level of 2.1. It's just come down a lot.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot. I mean, serious economic implications. You see what happens demographically in some countries, including Japan. Well, according to Bloomberg Opinion, the world's population is projected to peak around the 2080s and subsequently decline, driven by shrinking family sizes across Asia and the West. It is time now for the Business Week Women's Health segment. It's where we focus on key issues and developing technologies impacting the present and future of women's health around the world.
We do welcome Dr. Lauren Osborne. She's Vice Chair of Clinical Research, Department of OBGYN at Weill Cornell Medicine. She joins us from London. Dr. Osborne is a reproductive psychiatrist specializing in mental health during and after pregnancy. Dr. Osborne, so nice to have you here with Tim and me on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. First up, I just want to do the macro, if I may, and your thoughts about global birth rates here in the U.S. What have you seen in your practice about what's going on and what you see as kind of some of the main reasons? Is it complications in getting pregnant? Is it older age? What do you see from your vantage point?
You know, I think it's a variety of things that we're dealing with. Part of it is young people feeling less certain about the world and less certain about their financial futures and being more reluctant to have children. Part of it is being in a place where in much of the world, we do have choice about whether or not to have children. I think a lot of it is financial, though, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can open up a whole discussion about like what different governments could be doing or should be doing in your view to help encourage this. But I feel like at least in the United States, the idea of a dad or a mom being able to spend an extended period of time with a newborn is still a luxury. And I wonder to what extent that is something that holds people back.
I think that's a huge factor, especially here in the US. You know, we are one of the very few industrialized countries that doesn't have a standard set of parental leave. You still have to ask it as a favor in a lot of places. And even though we do have FMLA and people are obligated to give that leave, it's only certain companies. It's not necessarily paid leave. And that makes a huge difference in people feeling whether or not they can afford it, both in terms of finances, but also in terms of their ability to connect with their child and their emotional bonding with the child.
Okay. Again, here's another thing that I'm going to get hate mail. But if guys were having babies, do you think this would be different and that we would have figured this out?
Oh, you've asked a great question. I'm sorry to say I do think it would be different if guys were having babies. I think a lot of the place we're in has to do with just a lot of preconceived ideas about what motherhood is and the self-sacrifice that mothers have to make and the fact that half the population isn't going through that experience.
So let's go to that. Having had a child and just loving actually the whole process and being very lucky because I know it's not always so easy. And I know it can be difficult just getting pregnant. It can be difficult through the process. It can also be difficult afterwards. We know women get postpartum depression. Give me an idea of how common that is.
So it's surprisingly common. It's about 15 to 20% of the population in countries like the US and other industrialized countries. So when you think about it, it's much more common than a lot of other relatively common disorders. And yet it's very little talked about, studied, or recognized.
Why? Or is it just because we're women?
A part of it is because we're women, and I think we don't prioritize women's health. It was only in 2014 that the National Institutes of Health required science that is doing research in animals to use female animals in addition to male animals. So we're really far behind in terms of the research we have in women's health. We're far behind in terms of the advocacy that we need to get to the answers of why people develop postpartum depression and what kind of supports we need. One of the statistics that I find so shocking is that there's that 15 to 20% rate of postpartum depression, but the rate of women that we actually diagnose and treat is much, much lower than that, with only about 3% of women with postpartum depression are actually treated to remission, so treated until they get better.
How does that treatment typically work, doctor?
So there's a variety of things that we can use. Fortunately, we have a lot of good and evidence-based treatments. We just don't always put them in place where we need to. So there are a couple of different types of psychotherapy that are evidence-based for depression, in particular cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal therapy. We also know that traditional antidepressants are efficacious in postpartum depression. And then we also have some relatively new drugs that are based on hormonal mechanisms that also have some good evidence for treatment in postpartum depression. So we have the treatments, we're just not getting the moms to the place where they can access them.
And I guess in an ideal world, right, it would be great if you could predict if someone is going to likely have it. Is there something to it? And my understanding is that you're researching biological markers that could help predict postpartum depression. What are folks looking for? And I'm just wondering how this could maybe be a game changer for a lot of women.
Yeah, I do think it is a game changer because, as I said, we have good treatments. We just don't get women to the place where they need to get them. And part of that is that we're not sure who's at risk. Postpartum depression is something that can be caused by many different factors, both psychosocial factors and biological factors. But if we had a blood test or something that could really predict who's at risk, we'd be able to target the resources we have toward those moms who need them the most.
Yeah, look, I think this is something too, increasingly that partners are understanding, and in a world where, dads, the non-birthing partners have an understanding of this, they can increasingly be a supporter or play a role of support. How does that partnership factor in your work and in recovery?
I think that's a huge factor. One of the things that we know is a huge contributor to postpartum depression is sleep deprivation, which is common with a newborn. But I increasingly am seeing partners, non-birthing partners, who are really willing to invest that time to get up in the middle of the night and help the baby. And that can be such a support and can be a prevention of postpartum depression for the mom. We also, unfortunately, can see postpartum depression in the non-birthing partner. Yeah. So it's really a situation where the two partners have to support each other.
It gets us back to the idea, Carol, of having that flexibility and being lucky enough to have a job where you can actually, be away from work to spend that time at home.
I just got to do a shout out for my husband because he, on that and getting sleep, would do a nighttime feeding at midnight so that I could at least kind of get 4 or 5 hours of straight sleep. And that was part of our routine.
And he still cooks dinner for you every night too.
We
can't forget
he does
that.
cook dinner.
Okay.
He's a good man.
Amazing.
He's a good man. Dr. Osborne, I hope we can continue this conversation. Let us know how your research is going. Dr. Lauren Osborne, she's Vice Chair of Clinical Research, Department of OBGYN at Weill Cornell Medicine from Oxford. He's also a good cook.
You never bring leftovers in.
Because I eat them all.
Okay.
Stocks on the move and a check on trading when we come back.
The Businessweek Women's Health segment is brought to you by LifeMD. LifeMD, expert women's care to help you feel your best, because life is just getting good.